When the Grumman F4F Wildcat first appeared in the skies over the Pacific, Japanese naval aviators were initially unimpressed. At the time, Japan's premier fighter, the Mitsubishi A6M had already established a reputation for superb maneuverability, long range, and deadly dogfighting performance. Compared to the sleek and lightweight Zero, the Wildcat looked bulky, slower, and far less elegant. Early combat reports from Japanese pilots often described the American fighter as clumsy and unthreatening. Many believed that the Wildcat was merely a stopgap aircraft, unable to compete on equal terms with the Zero. Japanese planners assumed that their dominance in the air would remain unchallenged for some time. However, as the Pacific War intensified, this perception began to shift. Though the Wildcat lacked the grace of the Zero, it soon proved to be tougher, more durable, and more dangerous than Japanese pilots first imagined. The Wildcat's reputation in Japanese eyes evolved from one of dismissal to one of wary respect, especially as they realized that American tactics and pilot training could offset the technical shortcomings of the aircraft. In the early encounters of 1941 and 1942, particularly during the Battle of Wake Island and the defense of aircraft carriers in the Coral Sea, Japanese pilots quickly noted a defining characteristic of the F4F Wildcat, its ruggedness. Japanese 20 mm cannons, which could rip apart many Allied aircraft with a few well-placed hits, often failed to bring down Wildcats in the same way. Pilots reported frustration as Wildcats absorbed heavy damage and still managed to return to base. The Wildcat's radial engine and armoured cockpit gave it a survivability edge over the lightly built Zero. Japanese after-action analyses revealed that while the Wildcat could not match the Zero in speed or manoeuvrability, it could sustain battle damage in ways their own fighters could not. This durability forced Japanese pilots to change their expectations. Dogfights that should have ended with a kill often dragged on longer, costing fuel and time. Gradually, Japanese aviators began to understand that underestimating the Wildcat could be dangerous. In their diaries and reports, they grudgingly acknowledged that the aircraft was not as easily destroyed as they had once believed, hinting at a growing respect for its combat resilience. One of the most striking impressions Japanese pilots had of the Wildcat was its defensive nature. Unlike the Zero, which thrived on aggressive maneuvering and offensive tactics, the Wildcat often relied on defensive flying, energy retention, and teamwork. Japanese pilots noticed that American flyers rarely attempted to out-turn the Zero, which would have been suicidal. Instead, Wildcats used dive and zoom tactics, avoiding prolonged turning engagements. This fighting style, though initially frustrating to Japanese aviators who were accustomed to dominating opponents in dogfights, made sense once they realized the Wildcat's strengths. Reports from Japanese squadrons indicated irritation that American pilots seemed unwilling to play the game of turning duels. Yet the realization dawned that the Americans were adapting their tactics specifically to counter the Zero's advantages. This approach gradually made the Wildcat appear less of a weak opponent and more of a cunning one. Japanese pilots began to note that facing Wildcats was never as easy as it looked, especially when multiple Wildcats worked together using coordinated tactics. In their eyes, the Wildcat became a symbol of stubborn defense rather than graceful offense. A frustrating but formidable adversary. Japanese pilots also commented frequently on the Wildcat's relatively heavy armament. Equipped with 4 to 6 .50 caliber Browning machine guns, the Wildcat packed a punch. While the Zero also carried machine guns and cannons, Japanese pilots often felt that a single burst from a Wildcat could cripple or destroy their aircraft if it struck vital areas. In contrast, the Wildcat's armor and rugged frame allowed it to withstand more punishment before failing. This imbalance meant that Japanese aviators had to exercise more caution when engaging Wildcats head-on. After-action reports sometimes described the Wildcat as a flying fortress in miniature, a term that reflected both frustration and respect. The effectiveness of the Wildcat's firepower stood out particularly in carrier battles, where Wildcats provided fighter cover for dive bombers and torpedo planes. Japanese aviators began to recognize that even if the Wildcat did not dominate the skies in performance, its guns could deliver devastating consequences when opportunities arose. This respect for its firepower shaped how Japanese pilots approached engagements, forcing them to be more calculated rather than overly aggressive when facing groups of Wildcats. During the Battle of Midway in June 1942, Japanese aviators encountered large numbers of Wildcats defending American carriers. Initially, Japanese reports claimed significant victories against the slower and less capable Wildcat. However, a deeper examination revealed troubling patterns for Japanese strategists. Despite heavy losses on both sides, Wildcats often managed to protect key American assets long enough for dive bombers to inflict catastrophic damage on Japanese carriers. Pilots who survived the battle noted how difficult it was to clear Wildcats from the skies, as they often fought to the last bullet or attempted ramming maneuvers when heavily damaged. This aggressive spirit was not what Japanese pilots had expected from such an apparently inferior plane. For the first time, the Wildcat was no longer dismissed as irrelevant. Japanese diaries and intelligence summaries reflected a new realization. While the Zero remained superior in pure performance, the Wildcat's role as a shield for American strike aircraft made it an enemy that had to be taken very seriously. After Midway, Japanese perception of the Wildcat evolved from ridicule to a grudging acknowledgement of its strategic importance in air battles. Japanese air combat doctrine was heavily influenced by the belief in maneuverability and speed as the ultimate measures of a fighter's worth. Against this backdrop, the Wildcat seemed unimpressive. But Japanese pilots began to notice something else: the discipline of Wildcat pilots in sticking to specific tactics. Unlike some Allied aircraft that tried to match the Zero's dogfighting agility and were slaughtered, Wildcat pilots generally avoided fatal mistakes. They fought in pairs, covered each other's tails, and used altitude wisely. Japanese pilots, trained to rely on individual skill and maneuver superiority, sometimes underestimated the effectiveness of this disciplined teamwork. Reports from engagements described the difficulty of isolating a single Wildcat, as another one always seemed ready to swoop in for cover fire. This realization forced Japanese pilots to rethink their assumptions about air superiority. It was not just about individual aircraft performance, but also about pilot training, tactics, and cooperation. Over time, the Wildcat came to represent a new style of air combat that contrasted sharply with Japanese traditions. In this way, Japanese respect for the Wildcat grew, not because it was superior in design, but because it embodied a system of combat that was increasingly difficult to counter. Japanese perceptions of the Wildcat were also influenced by cultural attitudes toward machines and warfare. The Zero was celebrated in Japan as a symbol of national genius, lightweight, nimble, and deadly. The Wildcat, by contrast, seemed bulky and inelegant, even primitive in some respects. To Japanese eyes, it lacked the beauty and artistry of the Zero. But as the war dragged on, the very qualities that looked crude at first— thicker armor, stronger landing gear, a rugged engine— proved advantageous. Japanese pilots were often shocked when heavily damaged Wildcats still managed to return to their carriers, while their own Zeros, with their fragile airframes, often burst into flames or broke apart when hit. This led to a slow cultural shift in how Japanese airmen viewed the American fighter. While they never admired it in the same way they revered their own Zero, they began to view it as a symbol of American pragmatism, ugly but effective. The Wildcat thus embodied the idea that function could matter more than form, a lesson that resonated with Japanese pilots as they faced increasing losses. Another aspect that shaped Japanese views of the Wildcat was its performance in carrier operations. The Zero, though an excellent dogfighter, had relatively fragile landing gear and struggled with the demands of constant carrier operations in rough seas. The Wildcat, on the other hand, was designed from the start to endure the harsh realities of naval aviation. Its robust landing gear, ability to absorb hard landings, and compatibility with American carrier systems made it a reliable presence on deck. Japanese pilots, who often faced the challenge of losing aircraft, not to enemy fire, but to operational mishaps, noted this reliability with interest. Some reports even suggested envy of the Wildcat's sturdiness in carrier operations, especially as Japan's carrier fleet suffered mounting attrition. While Japanese flyers continued to believe that their Zero was the superior dogfighter, they acknowledged that the Wildcat's ability to consistently operate from carriers gave the Americans an operational edge. This reinforced the perception that the Wildcat was less about elegance and more about functionality, a realization that underscored the growing respect Japanese forces had for the aircraft's role in sustaining American naval air power. Japanese aviators also took note of the psychological resilience displayed by Wildcat pilots. Accounts from battles, such as Guadalcanal, highlighted the determination of American flyers to hold their ground, even when outnumbered. Japanese pilots, who had been trained in a warrior ethos that emphasized boldness and aggression, were sometimes surprised by the Americans' ability to fight effectively from a defensive position. The Wildcat, with its sturdy frame and strong armament, became a symbol of this defensive stubbornness. Reports described how Wildcats refused to break formation easily, forcing Japanese attackers to expend valuable fuel and ammunition in attempts to bring them down. This persistence was psychologically taxing on Japanese pilots, who were used to dominating opponents with quick and decisive kills. The Wildcat's endurance, both physically and in terms of the morale it projected, became a source of frustration and respect. Over time, Japanese aviators realized that fighting Wildcats required not just superior flying skill, but also patience and strategy, traits that did not always align with the aggressive spirit fostered in Japanese training. By late 1942, as the Solomon Islands campaign intensified, Japanese pilots were forced to acknowledge that the Wildcat was not going away. Despite their continued technical superiority in the Zero, the Americans kept fielding Wildcats in large numbers, showing an industrial capacity that Japan could not match. Japanese pilots began to view the Wildcat not just as a machine, but as a symbol of American persistence and resourcefulness. They observed how damaged Wildcats were repaired quickly and returned to service, while their own losses were increasingly difficult to replace. Reports emphasized the sense that the Americans were willing to grind out a war of attrition, something that deeply concerned Japanese strategists. In this context, the Wildcat's qualities, durability, reliability, and ease of production, were seen not as mere technical features, but as strategic assets. The Japanese began to fear that even if they won individual dogfights, the sheer persistence of the Wildcat and the system that supported it would eventually overwhelm them. Thus, the Wildcat became not only respected as a fighter, but also dreaded as a representation of America's industrial might. As the Guadalcanal campaign wore on, Japanese pilots began to notice that their initial air superiority was slipping away, not because the Zero was suddenly inferior, but because Wildcats were being used with increasing tactical sophistication. American pilots refined the thack weave, a defensive maneuver where two Wildcats covered each other by crisscrossing paths, making it nearly impossible for a Zero to get behind one without exposing itself to the other. Japanese aviators reported deep frustration with this tactic, which neutralized their turning advantage. They noted that the Wildcat's slower speed and weaker climb mattered less when flown in coordinated formations. What alarmed them most was how quickly the Americans adapted. In the early months, Japanese flyers believed that American pilots lacked the finesse and aggression necessary for true air combat dominance. By late 1942, however, the sight of disciplined Wildcat formations weaving defensively yet lethally was enough to change that perception. Japanese diaries described the tactic as annoying and effective, a telling acknowledgement that the Wildcat was not simply surviving, but actively undermining the Zero's superiority. This forced a reassessment. The Wildcat was no longer just a stubborn opponent, but a clever one. Another theme that emerged in Japanese commentary on the Wildcat was the disparity in pilot replacement. Japanese airmen often lamented that every Wildcat they shot down seemed to be replaced by another just days later. Even worse, many of the replacement pilots showed steady improvement in skill. In contrast, Japanese losses were irreplaceable. Their best pilots had been forged through years of combat in China and early Pacific campaigns, but as attrition mounted, Japan's training system could not keep pace. Japanese veterans noticed that Wildcat squadrons maintained a baseline competence that made them consistently difficult opponents. Some reports even suggested that the Wildcat was more dangerous in 1943 than it had been in 1942, not because the aircraft had changed, but because the pilots flying them had. This led to the conclusion that the Wildcat, as unimpressive as it seemed in isolation, was far more effective as part of America's broader system of mass training, rotation, and industrial production. The Japanese began to understand that their war of quality over quantity was gradually being inverted by America's ability to improve both simultaneously, with the Wildcat as one of the clearest examples of this shift. Japanese technical assessments also reveal interesting details about how they viewed the Wildcat's design. Intelligence units examined wrecked Wildcats whenever they could, and while they criticized the plane's bulk and lack of agility, they respected its simplicity. The Wildcat's airframe and radial engine were relatively easy to maintain, even under harsh conditions. Japanese engineers noted that this contrasted sharply with the Zero, which, while elegant and high-performing, required more careful handling and maintenance. From a logistical perspective, the Wildcat seemed better suited for prolonged, grinding campaigns in the Pacific's harsh environment. Reports suggested that Japanese analysts grudgingly admired the Wildcat's practicality as a warplane. They saw it as emblematic of American design philosophy: build something rugged, reliable, and easy to mass produce, rather than chasing the absolute limits of performance. This recognition underscored a growing realization within Japan that their own aircraft designs, while advanced, were not always well suited to the long war of attrition they had entered. In this way, the Wildcat served as an uncomfortable reminder of the strategic disadvantages Japan faced in balancing quality, production, and sustainability. Combat experience further shaped Japanese perceptions of the Wildcat's limitations and strengths. Many Japanese pilots continued to view it as inferior in one-on-one dogfighting scenarios. Against an experienced Zero pilot, the Wildcat was still vulnerable if caught without support or tactical advantage. Reports described how a Zero could still easily out-climb, out-turn, and out-accelerate a Wildcat in close quarters. Yet, what unnerved Japanese pilots was that Wildcats rarely allowed themselves to be caught in such situations. They climbed less aggressively, maneuvered more conservatively, and used dives to escape. This made them frustrating opponents because they did not fight the expected battle. Japanese pilots often found themselves chasing Wildcats downward in dangerous dives, where the Zero's light frame was at a disadvantage. These experiences contributed to the perception that while the Wildcat was not superior in terms of raw capability, it was highly effective when flown intelligently. This realization gave rise to a grudging respect. The Wildcat was not the best fighter in the sky, but it was one of the hardest to kill, and that mattered in the long run. In the naval battles around Guadalcanal, Japanese pilots often reflected on how Wildcats acted as both protectors and disruptors. Even when Wildcats could not destroy all incoming Japanese bombers or escorting Zeros, their mere presence disrupted formations and forced attackers into less effective runs. Pilots reported irritation at how Wildcats seemed to appear at the worst possible moment, diving into bomber formations and scattering them before they could reach their targets. While Japanese aviators sometimes criticized the Wildcat for lacking the elegance of their own fighters, they acknowledged that it was tactically well employed. Some accounts even described it as a wall in the sky, difficult to bypass without losses. The Japanese began to see that the Wildcat's true strength was not measured in kill ratios, but in its ability to delay, distract, and shield. This perception was significant, as it reframed the Wildcat not as a dueling champion, but as a strategic tool that denied Japan the ability to deliver decisive blows. Over time, this recognition weighed heavily on Japanese morale, as their offensives became harder to sustain in the face of such stubborn defenses. By the time the Wildcat began to be phased out in favor of the F4F Hellcat in 1943, Japanese perceptions had crystallized into a mixture of disdain and respect. They still believed the Zero was superior in pure flying performance, but they could no longer dismiss the Wildcat as irrelevant. Many Japanese pilots noted that the Wildcat had played a critical role in blunting their early momentum. Though they may not have admired it aesthetically or technically, they understood that it had been effective precisely because of its ruggedness, its firepower, and the tactics used alongside it. Some accounts suggested relief when newer American fighters began to replace the Wildcat, as this meant the Zero could now compete against more formidable aircraft. Yet, this relief was tempered by the realization that if America could make even the inferior Wildcat so troublesome, their newer designs would be even more dangerous. Thus, the Wildcat lingered in Japanese memory as an underestimated foe that had quietly but effectively shaped the course of the air war. Japanese reflections after the war provide additional insights into how they truly thought of the Wildcat. Many surviving pilots admitted that they had underestimated the aircraft at first, treating it as little more than a speed bump on their way to glory. In retrospect, however, they acknowledged that the Wildcat's combination of durability, firepower, and disciplined tactics made it far more formidable than they gave it credit for at the time. Some pilots even suggested that their overconfidence in the Zero and underestimation of the Wildcat contributed to Japan's eventual defeats. They recognized that the Americans had been willing to design a fighter that was good enough, and then produce it in overwhelming numbers, while Japan sought perfection in the Zero but failed to match production demands. This contrast, they admitted, revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of the nature of modern warfare. In hindsight, the Wildcat represented a lesson in humility. Never underestimate an opponent's tools, no matter how ungainly or unimpressive they may appear. From a strategic standpoint, Japanese analysts later recognized that the Wildcat symbolized the broader American approach to warfare. It was not the fastest, nor the most agile, nor the most advanced fighter of its time, but it was available in large numbers, backed by strong logistics, and flown with disciplined tactics. This mirrored America's larger strengths in industrial production, supply chains, and adaptive military planning. For Japanese planners, the Wildcat came to represent the danger of underestimating an opponent who values practicality over perfection. In a sense, it foreshadowed the challenges Japan would face as newer and more advanced American fighters entered service, each building upon the same philosophy of rugged effectiveness. In this way, the Wildcat was both a tactical opponent and a strategic symbol of the broader American war machine. Japanese reflections often emphasized this symbolic role, acknowledging that while the Wildcat was never the best fighter in the air, it embodied the qualities that would eventually lead to Japan's defeat in the Pacific. For individual Japanese pilots, personal encounters with the Wildcat left lasting impressions. Some remembered it as a frustrating opponent that absorbed damage and refused to go down. Others recalled the discipline and teamwork of Wildcat squadrons, which made them harder to defeat than the aircraft alone might suggest. A few even admitted a certain respect for the pilots who flew it, recognizing their tenacity in the face of superior Japanese performance aircraft. These personal recollections paint a nuanced picture. The Wildcat was not loved or admired, but it was respected as a serious foe. Its memory lingered as part of the broader story of how Japan's early confidence in air superiority gradually eroded. For these pilots, the Wildcat symbolized the stubbornness of the American aviators who refused to yield, even when the odds seemed stacked against them. This lingering respect suggests that while the Wildcat may not have been glamorous, it earned a reputation among Japanese pilots as a fighter that demanded caution, strategy, and acknowledgement. In conclusion, what Japan really thought of the F4F Wildcat was a complex blend of underestimation, frustration, and eventual respect. At first, Japanese pilots dismissed it as clumsy and inferior compared to the elegant Zero. But as battles unfolded, they discovered that the Wildcat's ruggedness, firepower, and defensive tactics made it a formidable obstacle. It absorbed punishment, disrupted attacks, and refused to be outmaneuvered in ways that mattered strategically. Over time, Japanese aviators came to see the Wildcat not as a rival to the Zero in technical brilliance, but as a symbol of America's broader strengths: discipline, pragmatism, and industrial might. Post-war reflections confirmed this shift, with many Japanese pilots acknowledging that their underestimation of the Wildcat had been a mistake. Ultimately, the Wildcat earned its place in history not by outshining its opponents in performance, but by embodying the stubborn resilience of the forces it represented. In Japanese eyes, it was never beautiful, but it was undeniably effective. A fighter that left a mark on their memory and played a pivotal role in the Pacific War's outcome.